Hello, Bolts My Minds! So recently I made a video about why the game Among Us is the chess of our times, and it might sound outrageous, but I think it makes sense in context, so if you don't agree with that, please take a look at it. But anyway, the point is that while making that video I learned a lot about chess, and specifically the chess family tree, because you see, chess was not originally invented as we know it today. It is the descendant of another game that was invented a long time ago, and this game had a bunch of children, you could call them. So it's like a family of games that evolved and changed all over the world. And I found this topic really interesting, and so I just want to tell you about all these different kinds of games. Let's start with Chaturagi. This game is not actually part of the family tree of chess, but for a long time people thought that it was, so it's like an honorable mention. Chaturagi is a lot harder than chess, because to play chess you only need one friend, but to play Chaturagi you need 3 friends, because it is a 4-player game, so it's already incredibly difficult. The pieces are arranged in a way that is very similar to chess, because you have all of these pieces that are the same in the front and all of these different pieces in the back. But the difference is that this is a game of chance, because you don't choose which piece you move each turn. Instead, you are supposed to throw dice, and depending on the number, that's the piece you have to move that turn. But, like in chess, each piece moves in a different way to try to capture the pieces of the other players. However, you don't lose if someone captures your king. It just so happens that the king is worth a lot of points, and in fact each piece is worth some amount of points, and at the end of the game, the player that has the most points is the one who wins. Also, like in chess, there are promotions in Chaturagi. When a pawn reaches the last row, it becomes another piece, but you don't choose which piece. If this was the pawn that was in front of the boat, it becomes a boat. If this was the pawn that was in front of a knight, it becomes a knight, and so on. But now let's move on to the real ancestor of all chess-like games, Chaturanga, which was invented almost 2000 years ago in India. You might also know it as Shatranj. This game is already very similar to chess. Starting with the theme, it is just 2 armies meeting in a field to do battle. And many of the pieces are recognizable. You have pawns, kings, rooks, knights, and you have elephants and advisors instead of bishops and queens. And we'll talk more about that later. All of these pieces also move in very recognizable ways. The pawns advance 1 square at a time and they capture diagonally, the rook moves like the rook, the knight moves like the knight, the king moves like the king, and the main differences comes from the elephants and the advisors. The advisors tend to move only 1 square diagonally, but there have been some slight variations over time, and there's a lot of variation of how the elephants move, and most likely it changed in different places at different times. There was a lot of experimentation with these 2 pieces. Actually, most of the differences between Chaturanga and chess arise from these rules for special cases. For example, the pawns in Chaturanga don't move 2 squares the first time, while they do in chess. There's also no castling, and when pawns reach the last row in Chaturanga, they are promoted, but only to advisors, which is not a very strong piece. It's not nearly as strong as the queen, and you cannot choose to promote them to anything else. Some differences also come from the themes, from having advisors instead of queens, and having war elephants instead of bishops. Although I personally would like it a lot more if chess had war elephants. I mean, that's so much cooler. Although this is an example of how these games are representative of their culture and the time when they were invented. A great example of this is Timur's chess, which has giraffes, camels, elephants, and war engines. But let's back up a bit. Timur's chess is the only one of all of these games in which we know who actually invented it. It was invented by, well, Timur. Timur was a board game designer born in 1336 in modern-day Uzbekistan. And as a side hustle, he was also the last great nomadic conquerors, who in his quest to reestablish the Mongol Empire, he didn't conquer the whole Mongol Empire, but he conquered a decent empire, and was responsible for the deaths of 17 million people, which was like 5% of the world population at the time, leaving a great legacy of conquest, destruction, but also patronage to the arts and board games. I get the impression that Timur saw Chaturanga and he was like, I like this game, but you know what it needs? More pieces. And so you have the knight, but also the camel. You have the rook, but also the war engine. You have the advisor, but also the governor. And of course, it wouldn't be a militarily themed game without giraffes. Although, for real, I have no idea why Timur added giraffes in this game. I checked and there were no giraffes in any of his armies. Or, for that matter, there have not been any giraffes in any army ever. They are simply not very good animals for war. I guess Timur just really liked giraffes. Now, all of these pieces move very similarly to chess. For example, the camel moves like the knight, just one square longer. And in fact, this is gonna be a theme in the video, that you have all of these different games with many kinds of pieces, but they all move similarly to chess. So unless there's something really weird going on, I'm just gonna say similarly to chess and move on. Although keep in mind that the elephant or bishop or whatever is always a wild card. It always moves differently and people never agree, like there's never even similarity between them. It's like, in my opinion, the elephant or bishop is the piece that has seen the most experimentation in any of these games. Now, what I really want to go over is what the hell is going on with the pawns. Each of them is different, but this doesn't mean that they move in different ways. They all just move like the pawns in Chaturanga. Instead, they are different only for promotion. You see, when they reach the last row, each pawn is promoted to a different piece, kinda like what happened in Chaturagi. So the pawn of knights is promoted to a knight, the pawn of giraffes is promoted to a giraffe, the pawn of rooks is promoted to a rook, and so on. There's even a pawn of kings that is promoted, you guessed it, to a king. And if you manage to promote it, you have two kings, and then your enemy has to capture both your kings in order to win, which is actually a kinda cool innovation. But there's also the pawn of pawns, which promotes in 3 different ways. When the pawn of pawns reaches the last row, you just leave it there, until some conditions are met, at which point you can just pick it up and put it somewhere else in the board, where it can capture another piece. And then, if you manage to get it to the last row a second time, well, you move it back to the position where the pawn of kings was. And then, if you manage to get it to the last row for a third time, it is promoted to yet another king. So it is possible for each player to have 3 kings. And so, conceivably, there could be 6 kings in the board at the same time. And each player would need to capture all the other 3 in order to win, which is just crazy. But actually, it sounds really fun. It sounds like a very interesting innovation. Although there are a lot of rules which I'm just skipping over here just for the sake of time, but if you want you can just go read them, links in the description. And it's just weird to me that there are so many rules regarding promotion, because getting a pawn to the last row is actually kinda hard, so it's not such a big part of the game. And one game that fixes this is shogi. Shogi was invented in Japan almost 1,000 years ago. And I get the impression that it happened something like this. Someone saw Chaturanga and they were like, I like this game. But this promotion thing is really cool to take a pawn to the last row and turn it into a stronger piece. It's such a great feeling. It's just sad that it's just like really hard to do. I just wish there was a way to make it a more prominent part of this game. In shogi, pieces don't promote when they reach the last row. Instead, they promote when they reach any of the last 3 rows. And it's really cool the way they promote them, because all the shogi pieces are flat and they have written the name of the piece in them. And so when you promote it, you just flip them over and voila, they have turned into another stronger piece. which is a great example of just good game design. Also, you might have noticed that pieces in shogi don't have different colors. Instead, you keep track of the pieces of each player based on where each piece is pointing. This is because when you capture a piece, later you have the option of putting it back on the board under your control. And so all of these mechanics are possible based on the design of the pieces, on the pieces being flat, pointy, and the same color. And I find this amazing. It's just a great example of how the design of the pieces of the game serve the mechanics of the game. I also like that shogi was more experimental regarding the themes of the game. So, for example, instead of all the pieces having names like just bishops or pawns or rooks, you have Dragon King, Flying Chariot, Jewel General, and Dragon Horse. Also in Japan, you have Dai Shogi, which I am convinced was invented by a reincarnation of Timur, because it's like someone saw shogi and they were like, I like this game, but you know what it needs? More pieces. And again, all the pieces move similarly to chess, but forget about that, just listen to the names. Phoenix, Violent Oxen, Flying Dragons, Blind Tigers, Ferocious Leopards, Angry Boars, Cat Swords, Reverse Chariots, Evil Wolves, and my absolute favorite name for a game board piece ever in all time, in all the multiverse, the Drunken Elephant. Like, if you're playing a board game and there isn't a piece called the Drunk Elephant, just throw it away. It will never be as good as Dai Shogi. That's it. It's just excellent. It's just excellent. This is the peak of game design. Although, for real, we don't know who invented Dai Shogi, but whomever it was, I have a feeling that we would have been really good friends. And now that we're in Asia, let's go to China and talk about Xiangqi. I get the feeling that Xiangqi is like Chaturanga that Freaky Friday into the body of Go. Because sure, you have an 8x8 grid, but the pieces don't move through the squares. Instead, they move through the intersections of the grid, the same places where you place the pieces in Go. It also shares some cosmetic similarities with shogi, because the pieces are also flat and have their names written on them. But unlike shogi, you don't flip them when you promote them, because in fact, you never promote piece in Xiangqi, and you can never put them back on the board. And unlike Timur's chess, there aren't crazy new types of pieces. And so, in a sense, it seems that Xiangqi is a very conservative version of Chaturanga. Except it's not, because it takes the idea that you are moving through the intersections of the grid and it creates the fortress, this place where pieces can move in special ways that they cannot move in other parts of the board. And this is where you find the king or the general and the advisor. And just a side note, the piece that we would recognize as the king or call the king, you cannot call it like that in Xiangqi, because they saw it as a taboo to have the emperor as a piece in your game, so they would often call it the general or some other name for a high-ranking government official. But anyway, also you might notice that you have this gap in the middle of the board. This is called the river. When a pawn crosses it, it gains the ability to move sideways, and elephants cannot cross it at all, but all the other pieces are unaffected by it. Also, while all the pieces move similarly to chess, there are some rules which makes it a lot more restrictive, and this in turn makes it a lot easier to block some pieces from moving entirely, which adds another layer of strategy to the game, that you can, instead of capturing the pieces of your opponent, you can just immobilize them. Also, there is this interesting rule that if you have two generals in front of each other, there must be a piece between them, like the generals cannot look at each other, which is another interesting way of immobilizing the pieces of your opponent. Now let's go to Myanmar and meet Situjin. I get the impression that whomever invented Situjin was like, well, if this is supposed to be two armies meeting in battle, why do they always start with the same formation? And that person was right. A big feature of war is how generals have the opportunity to arrange their armies in different ways to respond to different situations. And so in C2Jin, the pawns don't start all the way in the second row, instead they start near the middle, and players take turns placing all the other pieces however they want behind the pawns, which is really cool. It's like this meta game, like this game before the game, where you see how your opponent is placing their pieces and you can respond by placing your own pieces. And it's really cool. It reminds me of how generals in real life would redeploy their armies in different ways in response to something their opponent had done. But sadly, it seems that in C2Jin tournaments they often put a screen between the players so that they cannot see how the other is placing their pieces. Which, to be perfectly honest, I don't like it. I like the idea of seeing how your opponent is placing their pieces and reacting to that. It sounds really cool. And apparently that's how it's done in casual C2Jin. Also, another cool feature of C2Jin is, you guessed it, promotions. Pawns are not promoted when they reach the last row. Instead, they are promoted when they reach these diagonals that cross the board. And they are promoted to advisors, but only if your advisor has already been captured. So it's a way to bring it back. And I gotta admit, I really like this feature, because over and over we see how these games experiment with promotion, because it's a really cool idea and they try to make it a bigger part of the game. And C2Jin, in my opinion, found a really good way to make it a lot easier to do, and you can make it a lot of times during the game because your advisor can be captured many times, and so you can promote pawns to become advisors many times. And so yeah, it just brings promotion into the game. And now let's finally go to Europe, where a couple of innovations happened. First, we have the advisor becoming a queen, which I really like, girl power. And you also have the elephants turning into bishops, but you still don't have chess. For starters, we have the short eyes, Acece, or Assis, I have no idea how to pronounce this. And it's actually very similar to C2Jin. The pawns start near the middle and you can place your pieces behind them however you want. Except that the queen and this pawn start in the same square, and while they are there, they can be captured at the same time. But once they move, they can never go back and occupying the same square. Then Timur reincarnated again, this time in Spain, where he created the Grand Acederex. And yeah, it's basically like chess, but more pieces. And this time it brings the whole zoo. You have giant birds, rhinoceros, lions, giraffes, crocodile, and the only human pieces are the king and the pawns. And well, I guess the rook, although that's technically a building. Now, you shouldn't confuse the Grand Acederex with courier chess, but they both follow the same Timurid tradition of just chess but more pieces, although this time they are human. So you have the courier or the messenger, the archers, the sages, and my favorite, the jester. And again, in all of these versions, all the pieces move similarly to chess, but just not quite. And I could keep going. There are just so many other games, so many other variants. Like there's Mak-yek, there's this version played in Thailand where all the pieces are the same. There is Yanki, which is like a version of Shenki but played in Korea. And like really, we would never end. There are just, this family tree of games is just massive. But I guess it's time we finally meet the favorite child of the family, chess. Chess was invented in either Spain or maybe Italy sometime in the 1400s. And it's weird because while all of its siblings experimented in many different ways to be different from Chaturanga, chess was very conservative. 16 pieces, 8x8 grid, the arrangement of the pieces stays the same. And really, most of the experimentation came to how the pieces move. So for example, chess added that the pawns can move 2 squares the first time they move. There's also castling. And the queen, well, the advisor became the queen, and then the queen became a very powerful piece. And then you have the bishops, which, no joke, I think this is one of the most important innovations that chess made. Because before, well, you have the elephants, and they moved in all kinds of different ways. Really, like, no one could agree on how to move these pieces. But then whomever invented chess had this just genius idea of them moving like rooks, but diagonally. And this changed everything because it made them very powerful pieces, but it was also very important for the aesthetic of the game. Because now, if these pieces move diagonally, this means that there are a lot of squares that they will never reach, right? And if you so happen to have a checkered pattern on the board, which have not been present in any of the other games. All the other games have these grids, but just the squares are always the same color. But now, if you have this pattern of black and white squares, it's really easy to see which squares can the bishops move through. And so I think that this change in how the bishops move made chess a game a lot more interesting strategically, but also really impacted the aesthetic of how the game looks, which is also extremely important. And honestly, looking at all of these games, I'm kind of disappointed that chess did not experiment too much with promotions, because as in Chaturanga, pawns are promoted when they reach the last row, and really the only innovation in this case is that you can promote them to any piece you want. But honestly, there's no reason to ever promote a pawn to a rook or a bishop. I mean, in some fringe situations, you might want to promote it to a knight, but that's it, knight or queen. And so, yeah, promotion ends up this fringe rule that is interesting and is relevant in some games, but if you look at the really important chess games that have been played through history, all the great masters, promotion comes up not very frequently. And so, yeah, this is why I think that of all the games I've seen, of all the games I learned about for this video, I think that my favorite is shogi. I think it's just very interesting and it's actually really difficult because that ability of putting pieces back on the board, it just opens a whole new direction in strategy space. And yeah, I think I would never be good at shogi, but I think it's just a game that is more interesting to play. But that's just my opinion. But what is yours? Please tell me in the comment. Of all the games we've seen here, which one did you like the most? And is there some other version of chess, some other game in this family tree that you like and I did not talk about? If so, mention it in the comments. Well, yeah, thanks for watching. And a little bit of an afterword here. There have been also a lot of chess variants created in more recent times, like hexagonal chess and crazy house, and there are all these many variants. And if you guys found this video interesting and you want me to cover these more modern variants of chess, please also say that in the comments. And again, thanks for watching.